What if the most important financial lesson of the last 100 years was taught not in a classroom, not in a boardroom, but in a gas station parking lot at 6 in the morning, while a man in a plaid coat sat behind the wheel of his Ford LTD, engine off, waiting for a line that hadn't moved in 45 minutes? That man was your grandfather, or your neighbor, or the version of your father you never saw, the one who didn't have all the answers, the one who gripped the steering wheel and stared at the bumper in front of him and did the math in his head for the third time that morning. And the math kept coming out wrong, because the world he had built his life around had just changed the rules without telling him. This is the story of 1973, not the way they teach it in textbooks, wrapped in charts and policy language. This is the street-level story, the kitchen table story, the story of ordinary American families who woke up one October morning and found out that the comfortable machine they had been living inside had a fatal flaw. And the hidden truth buried in that story, the one nobody puts in the history books, is this: the families who survived it, the ones who actually came out the other side stronger, didn't do it by being richer or smarter. They did it by being more awake. They had learned something that the system spent decades trying to make you forget. Let's go back to the beginning. Picture a Tuesday in October of 1973. Not a dramatic Tuesday. Not a Tuesday with sirens or explosions. Just a regular American Tuesday. Leaves turning gold in the suburbs. Kids walking to school. Coffee percolating on the kitchen counter. Eisenhower's America had aged into Nixon's America, but the dream was still mostly intact. You worked hard, you bought a house, you bought a car, 2 cars if you were doing well, and every year life was supposed to get a little bit better than the year before. That was the deal. That was the unspoken contract between the American family and the American economy. The car was not just a vehicle. Understand that. In 1973, the American automobile was a religion. The average family in the United States owned 1.5 cars per household. The suburbs had been designed, literally engineered from the asphalt up, around the assumption that every adult would have a car and that gasoline would always be cheap and available. You couldn't get to the grocery store without one. You couldn't get to work without one. The entire physical layout of the American dream ran on petroleum, and petroleum cost about 35 cents per gallon. And nobody thought about it any more than they thought about the air they were breathing. Then, on October 6th of 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, the Yom Kippur War. And within days, the political dominoes started falling in a direction that nobody in those suburban living rooms had ever considered possible. The Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to use oil as a weapon. They announced an embargo. They would stop selling oil to the United States and to any nation that had supported Israel in the conflict, just like that. The tap got turned. And the most powerful economy on earth, the country that had won 2 world wars and put a man on the moon, suddenly found itself staring at something it had never seriously confronted before: scarcity. Not pretend scarcity, not a market correction or a temporary shortage. Real, physical, you can't have it scarcity. The kind that makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. The kind that reveals what a society is actually made of underneath all the comfort and the convenience. The price of oil quadrupled in a matter of weeks. 4 times the price. If you were paying 35 cents a gallon in September, by January of 1974, you were looking at something closer to $1.20, and you were lucky if you could find it at all. Gas stations started running dry, Some closed entirely. Others began rationing, letting each car have only 10 gallons, then 5, then whatever was left in the tank. Fistfights broke out in lines. A gun was pulled at a station in New Jersey. A station owner in Oregon was shot. And those lines became the symbol of the entire crisis. In cities across the country, the lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. People slept in their cars overnight to hold their place. Some stations only opened for a few hours each morning, and if you weren't there before dawn, you went home empty. The government eventually implemented an odd-even rationing system where cars with license plates ending in an odd number could only buy gas on odd-numbered days and even plates on even days. The American driver, the freest creature in the world, the king of the open road, was now rationed like a wartime citizen. But here's the thing that the nightly news didn't have time to explain. Here's the layer underneath the layer. The gas shortage was real, but the panic was a multiplier. Economists who studied the crisis later found that the actual reduction in oil supply to the United States was somewhere around 5 to 8%. 5 to 8% less oil. That's it. That was the physical reality of the shortage. But the behavioral reality, the lines, and the hoarding, and the fistfights, and the closed stations, that was not a 5% problem. That was 100% problem. It was complete paralysis. And it came not from the shortage itself, but from fear. From the sudden realization that the thing you depended on completely could be taken away, and you had no backup plan. You had never needed one. That is the trap, not the oil embargo. The trap was built 20 years earlier. To understand why 1973 hit so hard, you have to go back to the 1950s. You have to understand what America was doing to itself in the decade of prosperity, in the decade of the station wagon and the split-level house and the backyard barbecue. After the Second World War ended in 1945, the United States found itself in an extraordinary position. Its factories were intact. Europe and Japan were rebuilding from rubble. American manufacturing was the engine of the world. And the men who came home from the war, the young men who had spent years in the mud of Normandy or the jungles of the Pacific, they wanted something simple. They wanted a house. They wanted a wife. They wanted a car and a yard and some peace and quiet. They had earned it. And the system was very, very happy to give it to them, or rather, to sell it to them. William Levitt was building entire towns from scratch on the potato fields of Long Island, Levittown. Row after row of nearly identical houses, affordable and clean and brand new, each one with a small yard and a garage. By 1950, Levittown had 17,000 homes and 80,000 people. It was the blueprint. Developers copied it across the country, from California to Ohio to Florida. The American suburb was born, and it was born with a particular design feature that nobody questioned at the time. There were no sidewalks, there were no corner stores, there was no town center you could walk to, because you weren't supposed to walk. You were supposed to drive. Everything was designed for the car, which meant everything was designed for gasoline. At the same time, something quieter and more deliberate was happening to the American city. The streetcar lines were dying. In city after city, the electric rail networks that had moved people efficiently and cheaply for decades were being torn up and paved over. Los Angeles, which had once had one of the most extensive urban rail systems in the world, the Pacific Electric Red Cars, saw its entire network dismantled by the early 1950s. Buses replaced the rail lines, and then even the buses became inconvenient as the suburbs spread further and further from the city center. There is a story, debated by historians but dark enough to deserve mention, that a company called National City Lines, which was partly owned by General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil, had quietly been buying up streetcar systems in cities across the country and replacing them with buses that needed gasoline and tires. Whether it was a coordinated conspiracy or simply the natural result of industry interests, the outcome was the same. The American city became structurally dependent on the car, not by accident, by design, and the car culture fed itself. The Federal Highway Act of 1956, signed by President Eisenhower, committed the federal government to building 41,000 miles of interstate highway across the country, the largest public works project in human history at that point. It was sold as a defense measure, a way to move troops and evacuate cities in the event of a nuclear attack. But what it actually did was make driving fast and easy and cheap, which made the suburbs more attractive, which pushed more people further from cities, which made them more dependent on cars, which made them more dependent on gasoline. By the time 1973 arrived, the average American family had no realistic alternative to the car. None. You couldn't take the train because the train didn't go where you needed to go. You couldn't walk because the distances were too vast and the sidewalks didn't exist. You couldn't bicycle because the roads were built for cars going 60 miles an hour and there was no bike lane within 5 miles of your house. The trap had been built so slowly, so incrementally, over 2 full decades, that nobody had seen it as a trap. It just looked like progress. And then October came, and the oil stopped. And everyone was sitting in their Ford LTD, engine off, staring at the bumper in front of them, and for the first time they could see the walls of the cage they had been living in. Now, let's talk about the villain. Not the one with the keffiyeh and the press conference. The real one. The structural one. The villain of 1973 is not Sheikh Yamani, the Saudi oil minister, though he played his role with remarkable calm and precision. The villain is not Richard Nixon, though his economic policies, including the wage and price controls he had imposed 2 years earlier, made a shortage worse by creating artificial distortions in the fuel market. The real villain is something more abstract and more permanent than any politician or any foreign government. The real villain is single-point dependency. Single-point dependency is what happens when a system, a family, a business, a country relies completely on one input with no backup, no alternative, and no plan for disruption. It is the opposite of resilience, and it is, paradoxically, the natural endpoint of efficiency, because the most efficient system is always the one that cuts redundancy. No backups, no waste, no slack in the chain. And for 20 years, the American economy had been optimizing itself for efficiency. Cheap oil was abundant, so the system routed everything through cheap oil. Why maintain train lines when you have highways? Why build dense, walkable cities when you can build sprawling, car-dependent suburbs? Efficiency. And efficiency, when it meets an unexpected shock, shatters like glass. The families who suffered the most in 1973 were the ones who were most efficient in this sense, the ones who had fully committed to the suburban dream. 1 income, 2 cars, a house 30 miles from the workplace, no savings buffer, no vegetable garden, no community network to fall back on. They had done everything right. They had followed the plan, and the plan had a single point of failure. And that failure arrived on a Tuesday morning in October and didn't apologize for the inconvenience. The Nixon administration's response to the crisis was a masterclass in how governments make things worse while appearing to help. The odd-even rationing system created predictable hoarding behavior. Knowing you could only buy gas on certain days meant you always filled up completely whenever you could, which meant the lines were always long because everyone was always topping off, which meant the shortage felt permanent even when it wasn't. The government set price ceilings on gasoline, trying to prevent gouging, which sounds reasonable until you understand that price ceilings in a shortage cause supply to disappear. Why would a gas station owner sell gas at a controlled price when he could wait or divert supply or sell it under the table for more? The black market for gasoline grew rapidly. Truckers who could get fuel sold it to drivers who couldn't, at whatever price the traffic would bear. The crisis also hit the American truck driver with a particular ferocity. Truckers operated on thin margins, even in good times. Their entire business model was built on the cost of diesel being predictable. When diesel prices quadrupled and then the supply became unreliable, truckers started losing money on every mile they drove. In December of 1973, a nationwide trucker strike began. Tens of thousands of trucks pulled over to the side of the road and stopped. Drivers blockaded highways in Pennsylvania and Ohio. There were shootings. Tires were slashed. And the supply chain for everything, not just gas, but food and medicine and manufactured goods, began to seize up. The single-point dependency was revealing itself as a web. Everything was connected to everything else through the price of petroleum, and the web was shaking. But here is where the story turns, because not every family was paralyzed. Not every community collapsed into panic and hoarding and violence. Some people and some neighborhoods and some families discovered something in the crisis that changed them permanently. The families who survived the 1973 shock with their lives intact, and in some cases with their lives actually improved, shared certain characteristics. They were not necessarily richer. Some were decidedly poor. They were not better educated in the formal sense. What they had was a different relationship to their immediate environment. Think about the family who had kept the vegetable garden not as a hobby, but as a habit passed down from parents who had lived through the Depression of the 1930s. They grew tomatoes and beans and squash in the backyard. They had a chest freezer in the basement with a side of beef they had bought in bulk from a local farmer in August. The gas shortage was real, and it was inconvenient, but their table still had food on it because they hadn't fully outsourced their food supply to the car-dependent grocery chain. Think about the neighborhood where people still knew each other, where there were still front porches and block associations and the kind of informal networks where you knew which neighbor had a truck and which one worked close to home and who could give a ride and who needed one. In those neighborhoods, carpooling wasn't an emergency measure invented in November of '73. It was just what people did. The crisis found them already adapted. Think about the family where one parent worked from home or worked close enough to walk or bicycle, not because they had anticipated the oil embargo, but because they had valued proximity over convenience at some earlier point. They had chosen the smaller house near the center of town over the bigger house at the end of the cul-de-sac. They had taken what looked like the worst deal, and in the autumn of '73, the worst deal turned out to be the better life. The lesson embedded in these stories is uncomfortable because it points directly at a choice. Not a choice made in a crisis, but a choice made in comfort in the years before the crisis, when nobody was forcing you to think about it. The families who built resilience into their lives did so not because they were pessimists or preppers or eccentrics. They did it because they understood, consciously or not, that efficiency and fragility are two sides of the same coin. The 1930s had taught an older generation this lesson with brutal clarity. If you grew up during the Great Depression, you knew what it felt like to have the ground disappear from under your feet. You knew the value of a paid-off house, a full pantry, a skill you could trade for food, a neighbor you could trust. You didn't necessarily articulate it as a philosophy. You just kept the garden going. You kept a little cash under the mattress. You didn't throw anything away that still had use in it. You built redundancy into your life without using that word, because your body remembered what happened when you didn't have it. By 1973, that generation was in its 50s and 60s. Their children, the baby boomers, who grew up in the prosperity of the post-war decades, had mostly not learned the lesson. They had grown up in abundance, and they had been sold the idea that abundance was the natural state of things. The Depression was ancient history. The war was over. Progress was permanent. And the system had every incentive to keep them thinking that way, because a family that grows its own food and fixes its own appliances and lives close to work is not a very profitable family. The system needed you hungry and mobile and dependent. So what do you do with this information? How does a family in any era, not just 1973, use this history to actually change something about the way they live? The first move is the hardest, and it is purely mental. You have to be willing to see the cage. You have to look at your own life the way an investigator looks at a crime scene, without sentiment and without the need to protect the illusion of progress. Where are your single points of failure? What would happen to your household if the one income stopped, if the one car broke down, if the one grocery store 2 miles away closed, if the electricity went out for 2 weeks? Most people don't ask these questions because they are uncomfortable. The system prefers it that way. Comfort is the anesthetic that keeps you from noticing the trap. The second move is practical and slow. You don't build resilience overnight. You build it the way the Depression-era families built it, incrementally, one small decision at a time. You learn one skill that keeps you from needing to pay someone else. You build one relationship with a neighbor that is based on genuine mutual aid, not just a wave from the driveway. You put 1 month of food in the pantry. You reduce one recurring expense that ties you to the system. None of these moves is dramatic. None of them is a headline. But they compound, the way all small decisions compound. And over years, they become the difference between the family who sat frozen in the gas line and the family who shrugged and rode a bicycle to work. The third move is philosophical, and it is the one that the history of 1973 makes most clearly. You have to make peace with the idea that the better deal is often the one that looks worse on the surface. The smaller house, the older car, the less prestigious job that lets you walk to work, the neighborhood that is not the most fashionable, but where people still talk to each other over the back fence. The American system of the 1950s and 60s spent enormous amounts of energy convincing ordinary people that more was always better, that bigger was always better, that convenience was always better. And then 1973 came along and quietly demonstrated that the families who had resisted some of that messaging, who had kept some slack in the system, who had preserved some redundancy, were the ones who ate dinner without panic that winter. There's a man somewhere in this story who never got out of that gas line, who sat there until the station ran dry, then drove home with a quarter tank and a cold feeling in his stomach that didn't go away for months. He did his math that October, and he realized that the life he had built, the careful, correct, by-the-book American life, was balanced on a single wire, and someone else was holding the other end. Some men in that position just kept waiting for the wire to stabilize. They waited for the embargo to end, for the prices to come down, for things to go back to normal. And things did mostly go back to something resembling normal for a while, and they never changed anything, and they were never really comfortable again in the same way they had been before. But some men got out of the line, not literally. They still had to buy their gas that day, but mentally, quietly, they started asking different questions. Not how do I keep the machine running, but how do I need the machine a little less? Not how do I get more, but what do I actually need? Not how do I stay in the system, but how do I build something underneath me that the system can't take away? Those men, and the families they went home to that night, are the ones worth studying. Because the embargo ended, the lines went away, the gas came back. But the world where the lines can return, where the price can quadruple overnight, where the supply of the one thing your entire life depends on can be interrupted by a political decision made 10,000 miles away, that world never changed. It is still the world you are living in today. The names have changed. The commodity might change. But the structure, the beautiful, efficient, fragile, deliberately addictive structure of single-point dependency, that is still very much intact. The only question that matters is the same one that faced the man in the plaid coat in the parking lot at 6 in the morning in October of 1973. How long are you willing to sit in the line before you start building the alternative?